At 9:37 a.m. on Tuesday, September the 11th, terrorists flew American Airlines Flight 77 into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. All 53 passengers and 6 crew members on the plane died, along with 125 people in the Pentagon, 70 civilians and 55 military service personnel. Many others were injured physically and psychologically from the attack. A moving memorial is now open to the public on the grounds of the Pentagon, honoring all people affected by the event. Much has been written about all 3 terrorist incidents on 9/11, the attack on the Pentagon, the unimaginable destruction at the World Trade Center, and the thwarting of a 3rd attack by 33 passengers and 7 crew members on United Flight 93, which crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, injuring nobody on the ground. Still, there are many untold stories. The incidents at the Pentagon, and especially in New York, were so large that no one will ever know everyone who contributed positively to the response and in what ways. The number of different agencies, organizations, and corporations that supported the efforts will never be completely documented. Today, we will explore only part of the story at the Pentagon, 10 years later. This is the story of the senior command staff. I am Ron Carlee. I was county manager of Arlington in 2001. I have brought together today the 4 people who had the most critical operational responsibilities at the Pentagon on 9/11. Now, they will be the first to tell you that any successful emergency response relies on many people below them and from organizations that they do not control. In fact, some that they do not even know about. However, the operational command staff have to get it right, because if they don't, you cannot get the most and the best from other people. At the Pentagon, there is every opportunity for command to get it wrong. Here's what happened, and here are the players. The event first was a plane crash, a fire, building collapse, emergency medical response, with extensive casualties in Arlington, Virginia.
I'm Jim Schwartz. On 9/11, I was the Assistant Chief for Operations for the Arlington County Fire Department.
Hi, I'm Ed Plaugher. On 9/11, I was the Fire Chief for Arlington County.
Now, of course, the event was at no ordinary building. It was at the Pentagon, a U.S. military installation and the headquarters for the military of the world's greatest superpower.
Hi, Ron. I'm Jim Jackson. On 9/11, I was the commanding general for the military district of Washington.
And of course, this incident was no accident. It was the intentional act of terrorists attacking the United States of America.
I'm Christopher Combs. On 9/11, I was the FBI Weapons of Mass Destruction Coordinator.
3 agencies, 3 different command responsibilities, 1 incident. Who was in charge? Jim?
Well, you know, I think that has to be the most often asked question in the wake of 9/11 and other events. And there's not a simple answer to it, but I think the answer has to start with the idea that nobody's in charge of everything. You have to follow that question with another question: in charge of what? And there are many people that are in charge of many elements of the response. The key is to figure out how to unify that response so that it's coordinated and people are well aware of how to complement the decisions, the respective decisions that are getting made in various locations and in various levels of the response. So the way to do that is through the incident command system and by unifying senior leaders in a way that they can share information and, again, come to the best decisions collectively. At the same time, that only happens if we've done a good job of establishing both organizational and, on some level, personal relationships in advance of the incident, so that we are not trying to figure out who each other are on an incident and trying to figure out what each agency or what each individual brings to the table.
So what were you in charge of 9/11?
Well, in the initial stage of the incident, clearly the highest priority was life safety. So my focus was on dealing with the casualties that were both outside of the building and those that were still trapped in the building, gaining control of the fire itself, ensuring that there weren't additional hazards on the incident scene that might have been brought by the terrorists as a result of their attack.
So bottom line, you were the incident commander?
I was the incident commander, but supported by others in a very similar senior role that were there to assist in all of that high-level decision-making.
So Ed, you're the fire chief. What's your operations guy doing as the incident commander? Why not you?
Well,
You're the senior guy.
The incident of this magnitude, and all incidents of this magnitude, require a senior executive to have the overarching authority to run the incident and bring all the players together under a common tent or a common platform. Establishing and making sure that every aspect of the incident is not neglected or forgotten takes a key leadership role. And there has to be an overview. There always has to be somebody who basically makes sure that nothing is awry and that all the key elements, making sure that the appropriate set of resources and that it works within the overall regional response capability that had been worked on for decades in the Washington metropolitan area. And senior leadership has to play that role.
So this is one of the biggest events in your life, isn't it?
That's one of the biggest events in the history of our nation, particularly when it comes to response.
But you didn't feel that you needed to be there on the ground commanding the incident, that you had other things that you needed to be spending your time on?
Yeah, the philosophy that is part of the incident command system and is one of the fundamental pieces is that you have to have trust in the people, you have to have competent people in the appropriate places, and the operations chief is the best incident commander that I had at the time, as well as place him and the other individuals being placed in the appropriate roles. So in other words, even though the incident commander has a critical aspect of this incident in all incidents, they still have to rely upon other people. So if you send the message that you don't have trust and confidence in your employees, then the incident will not go properly. And so it starts at the top. There was no doubt in my mind that we had the best people in the best place doing the best thing that they could possibly do at that day, at that incident. But they needed assistance, they needed help. They needed an overview. How big was this incident? How complex was this incident? We knew that there were going to be mass amounts of additional players in this incident and that the incident had to be contained. And that was my focus right then and there, was to make sure that we got the incident contained so that we could get our arms around the incident while we were focusing. Jim and all of his key leaders were focusing on doing their roles, which was assessing the incident, applying appropriate resources, and then making sure that throughout the entire process that we didn't injure or kill any additional firefighters, that we protected the community that we were responsible to protect, and at the same time make sure that the key players, and because it's a key government facility, that the key players were laced into the process. So this is all about continuing the relationships, affirming the relationships, and making sure that it all flows appropriately. So there is what is called, in the incident command system, what is called the senior advisor role. The senior advisor is the only person who has the ability to remove the incident commander. That was the role I played that day.
Okay. General Jackson, this is your building, though. This is the Pentagon. How do you let someone else command an incident of this national, international importance on your ground? I mean, this is not civilian territory. This is a U.S. military installation.
Well, it was actually pretty easy. We went with the people who had the best capability to deal with the problem at hand, and that was the fire department. While the military's got assets, and we had actually some fire responders down there at the Pentagon. It was not really within our, it wasn't within our capability or our desire to command the thing at that time. So we went with the pros, and it was a fairly easy decision to make.
So what was your role down there? One,
Well,
you had to make that decision. You had to agree to let the pros handle it. But what else did you have to do? I mean, this is the Pentagon.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my role was to be there to be the conduit that the incident commander could use to get into the Pentagon. And so I became the point of contact and allowed me and my staff to work with the right people inside the building, because obviously you got some senior governmental officials there who are interested. They're going to want to know information, and they're going to want to keep track of what's going on. And of course, our desire is to feed them that information without it becoming a burden. The other aspect was, because of my position in the district, I had access to military assets from both inside the district to outside the district that I could basically, at my command, pull in. And so, again, I was interfacing with the incident commander to find out what he needed and what we could do to support. And then when he asked, we provided.
Chris, this is a pretty big crime scene. In fact, you had 3 huge crime scenes in the FBI simultaneously. So how do you approach a working event like this, the fire collapse, and it's your crime scene?
Well, when we look at terrorism scenes, we really break it into 3 phases. A lot of people ask me, how is it the fire chief is in charge of a major terrorist attack? The first phase of any terrorist event is usually a life safety. And as everyone's talked about, the only organization that can really do life safety and rescue is the fire service. So in phase 1 of that incident, we look to the fire department to be the incident commander. And then once we transition from phase 1 to phase 2, which is the crime scene phase, that's when the FBI is the incident commander. And then once we're done with that crime scene, we turn it over to a consequence management phase, which we would turn it over to FEMA, or in this case, because it was a DOD facility, we turned it back over to DOD as the incident commander.
Now, at the early stages, this is all happening so fast, so how did you figure this out? How did you decide how you're going to establish unified command and not have chaos at the Pentagon?
Well, let's acknowledge that in the beginning of any kind of crisis of this magnitude, there is chaos. Our job, one of our first orders of business is to try and bring some order to that chaos. So the chaos is part of the early stage of the incident, and it's through our tried and true practices of incident command, which the FBI had practiced with us many times before. One of those stories that you may have alluded to in your introductory comments that gets lost is that we had a major exercise in the Northern Virginia region the Saturday before 9/11 that all of the fire departments in the region and the FBI all participated in. It was a major chemical exercise that we did out in Fairfax County, Virginia. And that was one more of those opportunities for us to not only get to know each other, but figure out how we were going to interoperate with each other. And so coming together 3 days later, and it wasn't just that exercise that did this, there was already a great deal of understanding about how we were going to work together on this kind of an incident. And so by working together, you see who's got strengths and who has capabilities that you can rely on to, again, start to bring order to some of that chaos.
I know, Chief Plaugher, you were really committed to building an organization that could respond to a terrorist, but you'd never had a terrorist event. In fact, Arlington had never even had a really major event in its entire history. It didn't even see a battle in the Civil War. And so how do you set a priority to spend time and energy on something that has never happened and may never happen again?
It's always in the competition for needs and what's going on within your organizations. But you just have to stay stalwart. You just have to always continue to work hard. One of the stalwart moments, or one of the key moments in the history of Arlington, from my perspective, being a brand new fire chief to Arlington County, was the Tokyo incident that occurred in '94 with the sarin gas attack, which truly, from my perspective, told us that we needed to revisit how we were set up and what we were doing, particularly for the region and our preparedness. Once we started that, once we assumed the leadership role in Arlington to prepare the region for a chemical or a biological attack, once we started working diligently to make sure that we had the entire region on the same page, fire chiefs, police chiefs, working hard with the FBI on the command and control systems, making sure that we had everything working properly, it started to gain momentum. We started to receive federal funding. We started to receive federal recognition. We were making progress in the recognition that it was going to take the entire region to manage this incident. And so we continued in that vein. Was it difficult from time to time because of the competing needs of organizational and budget requirements and that sort of thing? Absolutely. Was it hard to get staff engaged and move them off other projects and that sort of thing? But some things you just have to believe in. Some things you have to realize that the potential is that great. I also realized, and I truly think every fire chief out there will recognize this, in that the real job of a fire chief is to assess risk and make sure their organization is aligned to meet those risks. To me, it was very obvious, being in the nation's capital, being on the door of the nation's capital, that we had a terrorist problem. and that we needed to be prepared for it. The region needed to be prepared for it. We had a great system for firefighting in Northern Virginia. We don't use political boundaries to determine what type of fire response goes to a community. And we just unfolded that throughout the entire Washington metropolitan region. A lot of it was built upon the platform of the Air Florida crash that had occurred decades earlier. And so we had a great foundation to build upon. We just needed to plug and play a terrorist response capability on it, and we needed to exercise it. We did exercise it on the grounds of the Pentagon.
So you were inspired by or motivated by the attack in Tokyo and started work to prepare for a chemical attack, which we didn't have. We had a plane crash. And we've spent a lot of time since then preparing for terrorism. You're fire chief now. You've got to make the decisions he was trying to make then about priorities. Are we spending too much time on terrorism? Especially when you see the number of weather events that we've had since 9/11. Mother Nature's been much more effective than terrorists in attacking our country.
Well, yeah, I think each community has to assess what are the most likely risks, what are the most likely events that they are going to encounter, and build their system to be able to react to those most likely events. Certainly, you know, in the Midwest, tornado activity is most prominent. In the Southeast, hurricanes, you know, as we start the new hurricane season now, are most prominent. And in many of the urban areas, terrorism remains somewhat of a threat. Now, how to measure that threat, I think, is less material than trying to build systems that are adaptable and that can deal with different kinds of threats. You know, when you talk about your preparedness activities, what you're really doing is building baselines of capabilities that can be used for a weather event or for a large fire, or in our case on 9/11 for an act of terrorism. So I think, you know, the term all hazards is used a lot. That term has to be used in a way that acknowledges that we can't prepare for everything equally, but we have to prepare for everything on some level, because every community could be touched by, you know, some sort of large weather event or an act of terrorism.
You share that philosophy, Ed?
Yeah, I was going to say, Ron, in addition, I think it's all about confidence and competence, and making sure that organizationally that the things you do builds organizational confidence and competence. And your approaches have to be such that they're building that they're always building the strength of that from every aspect of your response. Then if you haven't hit it perfectly right, airplane into the side of the Pentagon, which we didn't hit, nobody did, didn't hit it right. We knew that we had the confidence and the competence to manage that type of a large-scale, multidisciplined regional response, because we had built that confidence and competence throughout the entire system. That's stalwart. That is absolutely a fundamental piece of what every community needs to do, and you do that one day at a time. You do that every incident at a time. You plug out and use the incident command system every time. You reinforce those fundamentals and principles, just like they do in the military. They don't haphazardly do a small skirmish. They do everything appropriately at every time. And that's how you build the confidence and the competence. And we just took that model. We grabbed it from the military.
I think part of what we're talking about here is that you're institutionalizing a lot of these behaviors. You know, right. when we started after the Tokyo attack, you know, with building new capabilities, we had an awful lot of people who didn't get it. We had an awful lot of people who were wondering, you know, I came into this business to crawl down smoky hallways or take care of sick people, transport them to medical care facilities, that sort of thing. Why are things shifting? And the reason they were shifting was because, you know, we evaluated the potential for these new and emerging threats to be different than they were in the past. And so, you know, this building of relationships is critically important. But you've got to institutionalize this, because, you know, when the general turns over or the chief retires or, you know, somebody from the FBI moves on to another assignment, the organizations have to be able to still function in the same way that, you know, the original leadership intended. So it's about institutionalizing these behaviors.
Doesn't that speak somewhat to Jim's point of engaging people as far down in the organization as possible?
Yeah.
Now, they're working on all hazards approach over here at the local level. You live and breathe anti-terrorism every single day. People don't think of the FBI interfacing necessarily that well at the local level. And you watch TV and movies, and FBI comes blazing in with all their high-tech equipment and takes charge. What's your reality and experience there?
Unfortunately, we suffer a lot from the Hollywood factor, which is absolutely would not happen. Every time we roll out, and we're rolling every day with our local responders, it's joining a unified command team that's already set up by local responders. Local is always going to be first. Everything is a local event. So when the FBI gets to a scene, whether it's 6 minutes into it like we did on 9/11 or it's an hour into it, we are designed to fit into the existing unified command structure that the locals have set up and be a partner in that. Again, even though 9/11 is a terrorism event, the FBI very honestly said we can't lead this beginning effort because we don't do rescue and recovery. So we turned to the fire department to say, how can we mesh our operations? You're the priority, there's no question about it. We still have to begin a criminal investigation, but how do we do that not adversely affecting what you have to do?
So if I'm a local fire chief or a local city or county manager and I don't have relationships with the FBI, who should I be talking to?
The first person everyone should know in the FBI at an operational level is the WMD coordinator, the Weapons of Mass Destruction coordinator. That individual's job, his function in life, is to effect liaison with our state and local partners for terrorism response, or any kind of response where the FBI is going to a scene and interfacing with state and local partners. That is your operational component for the FBI. So that's the first level. And then up to the special agent in charge, the SAC, where the chief, the county manager of those agencies need to know that individual, because the special agent in charge is really that first federal person who will be on scene, who can command the federal resources and request additional federal resources from outside of that region to come in. And it's important to have those relationships, as the general said, from the chief to the special agent in charge, through the operations staff to that WMD coordinator.
Thank you. Now, the Pentagon's, of course, unique. National Capital Region's unique. But we got military installations all over the country. And so what should local leaders and installation base commanders be doing in terms of establishing relationships? Should they be? Does it matter?
Oh, absolutely, and it's happening every day. You aren't going to go to any single military installation in this country, and if you find the garrison commander and he doesn't know who the people outside his boundaries are that he's going to interface with, you might as well get rid of them. I would tell you within days he's going to be making those links. Is very early in his assumption of duties, he's going to be taken downtown and introduced to the right people, because there's a variety of good reasons for it. You know, if there's an incident that happens outside his base, he may have resources that other people need, and they're going to want to know who to go to get those in a very rapid situation. If he has a problem on the base, he's going to rely on assets coming on board. For instance, at Fort Myer, if there's a problem, the fire department responds and helps to respond at Fort Myer, because they only got one small station on Fort Myer. And they rehearse that periodically. And so it's all tied to knowing how to deal with a situation on the ground, at least in the broad framework of it. There's basics to every incident. You got to deploy, you got to assess, you got to start making some plans, or at least identify some plans. You got to evaluate those plans, you got to pick one, and you got to execute. Mm-hmm. These guys all go through the same kind of process that we do. And so what you do is you come together to be able to figure that out. And that's why those relationships are important. And they're happening every day out there throughout this country.
I want to talk a little bit about some of your personal reactions, if I may. You know, one of the points that you've made to me, General, is that your professional training led you to be the one to cause these events, to attack other people, our enemies. And in this case, our enemy attacked us. What was your reaction when you arrived at the Pentagon and saw your headquarters successfully attacked by an enemy?
Well, I don't think there wasn't this immediate rush of emotions or anything. I mean, there was a problem. It required some action, and therefore we were the ones to do this. It was obvious to me that I was going to become a focal point for the military response. So again, as I rolled into the Pentagon that day, first thing I was doing is, as I just mentioned, I was assessing, I was looking, I was trying to get a feel for what was going on, who was out there doing certain things. And of course, I saw the fire department, and it was obvious to me that they're fighting a fire. Sounds like that's about what they ought to be doing. And so we connected at the right time and place to find out, what can I do to help you? Because it looks like you're doing the right things here. And that's when we started talking and sharing and deciding what to do next. And based on some conversation, we started bringing assets down. So it really, I mean, you're almost operating off of autopilot when you move in there. It's off of prearranged thoughts and patterns that you've built, and you know, the way you decide, the way you engage, and you're just doing. I brought some staff with me, and of course they moved around with me, and they were, you know, offering insights and assistance and communications back and forth. But it was, I mean, it was a pretty hectic time. It wasn't several hours before we looked at our watches and realized what time of day it was. But I mean, there were things going on. It kept us busy.
Yeah. Did you stay too long your first shift?
Probably. I remember going home late that night, real late that night. But you know, again, making sure the right people were set up to be able to handle things that night. And as it turned out, as I was going home, the fire reignited in the building, and there was another recall for the fire engine, and they moved down there. And of course, they were able to deal with that properly. And you know, next morning we reassessed and moved on from there.
3 simultaneous terrorist attacks, 2 unbelievably successful. FBI take that personally?
I don't know if it was personal, but we understood immediately that we were under full attack. And even for us, it was bigger than the 3 sites. We also had the hijack airports, which for us was a site. So while we're at the Pentagon with hundreds of agents, we actually set up another command at Dulles Airport where the hijacked plane took off from. We had 100 agents out there. So with us, we very quickly had to break it down into different components. We had our response component to the sites, our investigative components to those hijack airports.
And you didn't know if it was over.
And we didn't know if it was over. In fact, we were receiving immediate intelligence that a number of jumbo jets coming across from Europe accidentally had tripped their hijack messages to tell us they were under hijack coming in. So there was that fog of battle of, we have additional planes out there that are coming in. Where are there more attacks planned? What is the next step? So we were looking in many different directions as to what the problem was.
Yeah, so what were you feeling on that day?
I mean, I can distinctively remember standing there with Jim and saying, you know, this is it. This is what we've been training for. The fight is here. In somewhat disbelief, obviously, with the size and scope. Being on the scene, though, we didn't have a full view of what had happened. We knew New York had been hit with 2 planes. I personally was not aware of the collapse of those towers for hours into that day. The events that ended up happening in Shanksville, we didn't really have a full, clear picture of that for much later in the day. We knew there was a plane that had gone down. My initial reports to me that the plane had hit Camp David, which led to more confusion. Yeah. There was a lot of intel out there from a number of streams that talked about other attacks, and we were working to either confirm or push aside that intel is not accurate. But we had reports that the State Department had been hit, the White House had been hit. Luckily, we could see D.C. from where we were, so we didn't see the smoke, and we pretty much felt that wasn't true. We were told that Cleveland had been hit. We weren't quite sure why or how that played into it. So you definitely had that fog of battle that we had to chase down to provide the intelligence to the partners.
Did you overstay your first shift?
Absolutely. I think everybody did, and you know, it's hard. Everybody knows you need to go home, you need to turn command over. I think the perfect shift is a dedicated 12-hour shift, and then people need to leave to rest, to come back for your next 12-hour shift. It's hard to do. It's hard to have people leave. They leave, they want to come back, they want to be in the fight. And that's one thing that we've tried to work on is, you know, after 12 hours, if you look at the research, accidents go up, your cognitive ability goes down, so you really want to try to push people out after 12 hours, but it's a hard task to manage.
Yeah. Either of you go home after 12 hours?
No, I didn't go home the first time until the night of the 12th. So, close to 36 hours before I got my real first break. And I echo what Chris and the General have said, that you've got to make those in more manageable pieces. And I'd go one step further, that I think in the initial stage of the incident, somebody who's going to be in that prime decision-making role probably, needs to get a break after 4, 5, 6 hours, and I mean a significant break, because the amount of decision-making going on in the early part of an incident of this scale is just enormous. And it'll settle down after a while, but just the way things are coming at you, and the way that you're walled off from everything, other than the incident, I think just calls for consideration to spell somebody in one of those positions even earlier than 12 hours. You can then get into a rhythm and get people in 12-hour shifts after a little while. But I think in the first phase, it's got to be far sooner.
Mm-hmm. Could you do it today? Could you employ that discipline?
Well, today I wouldn't have to, because I've got good operational commanders that I would probably have to be influencing. I'd probably be the one making those decisions, telling my operational commanders, you need a break. But hopefully with the experience of 9/11 and the hindsight of these years, perhaps maybe I'd have enough wisdom to try and spell them in that way.
Can you remember what you felt when you arrived on the scene?
I don't. Clearly there was a sense of awe, but I think it was somewhat tempered by the fact that we were watching the images in New York evolve before it happened at the Pentagon. We had watched, as much of America did, that second airplane go into the South Tower, which for us confirmed what we had already assumed because of the first airplane, and that was that these were intentional acts. This was an act of terrorism. So I think there was maybe a momentary sense of disbelief, but then, as the General said, you're going to work. You've got to marshal all of your energy, towards executing the tasks that need to be done, to focus on life safety and gain control of this fire and gather the situational awareness. If you are going to be overcome by emotion, you're going to be far less effective. And I don't know that anybody, certainly in the leadership team, was feeling that way.
What were you feeling, Ed?
Actually, it's a great question, Ron, but actually now that I reflect upon it, there were no emotions. I mean, I was pure focused on making sure that we had the right resources, the right players, the right individuals in the right places, making sure we had the right assets, enough EMS assets and enough fire assets on the incident scene. And actually, I think it was a couple of years later before any emotions really started to come back in. It was pretty remarkable, because I'm a pretty emotional guy, and the department knows that. But at the same time, I basically didn't know I had the ability to just turn them off, and just went to work. Commandeered a helicopter from the Park Police, made sure that we understood the complexity of the incident, made sure we understand how much of the Pentagon, 6.6 million square feet, was involved in this incident. Did we have enough assets and resources? Did we have, there was 24,000, 25,000 people at the Pentagon. Did we have enough EMS assets to deal with the consequences? Was it laced with a chemical or a biological? Was all those things to work? I was also wearing at the same time the county's emergency coordinator hat, so I also had an emergency operations center, which had a guy who had been there one day who was operating the emergency operations center as part of your team there. And so I'm not really sure I had room for emotions. I really don't. And now that I think about it, I probably didn't have room for emotions.
Is that true? Is that a similar story for each of you?
Yeah, you're into that almost muscle memory at this point. You're just going with what you've been trained to do.
Yeah.
There was some thought, though. Every once in a while where you had a brief moment, for instance, some of us knew people who were in that building. Right. And so you'd have these flashes periodically, but then you'd come back to reality, and you couldn't allow yourself to go down that road. There'll be time later to grieve. Right now, the mission at hand is to get this area fixed and get it under control. And when you're working with guys who know what they're doing, it's not hard. You kind of saddle up together and off you go.
And focus on mission.
Sure. Well, and you asked about going home. I went home, but I didn't go home. So I just might as well go back. So it was one of those things that it wasn't even any use for me to be there. Yeah. Just shower, change, and go back. And I did. And because it's not something that...
you can't go home and lay down and go to sleep, can you?
Oh, no. you can go home, but you're not going home. So I mean, it's one of those situations. Yep.
So let me ask you to talk about this a little bit. We focused on the three lead agencies that, by statute and incident, really had command responsibilities. But there are a lot of other agencies involved. Could you just talk a little bit about some of the other agencies you worked with and the importance that they play in this incident and any large-scale incident of this magnitude? Who are some of the other critical players out there?
Wow.
Well, I'd have to start with, for a local community, there's obviously a lot of focus on the fire department and the police department, the public safety agencies that are going to be on the forefront. But the reality is, in an incident like this, it's the entire community. It's certainly in the first hours, the entirety of whatever government resources are available that have to essentially drop what their daily responsibilities are and marshal their efforts towards this crisis, towards the dealing with this crisis. So a lot of the lost stories in an event like this are the way our Parks and Recreation Department and our Environmental Services Department, then called Public Works, even our libraries, the personnel that work in those jobs that we too often take for granted in, when we're talking about a crisis like this, that really fell in and did critical work to support those of us that I would say were on the front lines, but just did enormous work that was extremely important to our success.
People don't think of Parks and Recreation and libraries in the context of terrorism.
No, they don't think of that at all. One of the very first resource requests that Chief Plaugher urged us to make was 6-foot chain link fence, 2,000 feet of it, so that we could create a physical barrier and begin to control access to the incident site. Well, where do you get that? Where does that come from? And it was our Parks and Rec department in Arlington that had access to that as a resource, and through our Emergency Operations Center got that tasking and produced, in a way that we weren't waiting days for that kind of critical asset, that kind of critical resource. It was there in just a few hours and was assembled, and we had our first hard barrier that enabled us to control access to a crime scene, and to one obviously that had still a lot of casualties that needed to be dealt with.
Military has a lot of different components to it. What was the interagency coordination like?
Well, inside the military, it wasn't too difficult. The executive agent for the Pentagon is the Secretary of the Army. That was Tom White. And as I recall, we bumped into each other fairly early on that day. And I was informed officially that I was going to be the guy. Of course, I'd already assumed that, so it wasn't a big surprise.
It's good to know that you're supposed to be in charge when you are.
But it was a formality, but it was, it was appropriate. You have all the contacts within the building, the different services and the different offices and so forth that had to be addressed, and people wanted to know what was going on. On my side, though, I think one of the organizations we dealt with routinely was the Arlington Police Department too. They were all over the place, sealing off the roads for us and allowing the right people access. And that was a fifth guy who was in the room with us usually, talking to us about, what can I do? What do you need from me? And then on my side, I had 5 installations, and all of them were wanting to know what was going on. One of them right up the hill.
So in addition to the Pentagon, there were 5 other military installations that were part of the military district of Washington.
And so I had to, Fort Myer obviously was engaged, and I had elements of them down talking to us all day long. But Belvoir was involved too. And then Fort Hamilton up in New York was involved in providing assistance down to Ground Zero. And so at some point in time, I was put on the phone talking to my people up at Fort Hamilton, asking them what they were doing and what was going on up there, and kind of got an earful from them too. So it's just a matter of balancing your time and coordinating with them. But the other organization I think that needs to be mentioned here is the actual families that were involved. What took place right away was a lot of confusion and people basically going out of communication links with their families. Families heard about it and immediately wanted to know where their loved ones were. Well, no one knew because they were all scattered, they were all gone, they were out doing things. That many of them were out helping injured people until we got enough workers down there to replace them. And then there was a lot of phone calls coming in from around the country. And how are you going to manage that? You know, people from California calling about, you know, son who was working in the Pentagon. And the families actually, the wives actually got together and set up a calling bank, and they were basically fielding phone calls. And they did that for several days.
And that wasn't a pre-planned response, it was a reaction to the realities of the moment.
Yeah, it was an understanding that there were going to be people concerned around the country because the military is not a local organization. I mean, they come from all over the country, and so there's going to be people calling in from all over the place wanting to know where their nephew, their niece, or cousin, or whatever is. And so there had to be a way to do that. And so they set up a number, posted it out on the wire, and people started calling. And they ran this 24 hours a day with multiple wives. All the senior wives participated in it, and they were answering all sorts of strange phone calls. Strange being, has anyone seen my son? Well, who's your son? And trying to figure out now, where was that person? Was he assigned to the Pentagon? All they knew that he was working in Washington. They assumed the worst and may or may not have even been there, but someone had to go find out for him. And so that took place. So there was a lot of those kinds of activities going on, and the family certainly coalesced around those things and were very, very helpful for us.
Yeah, it seems to be one of the pieces that's easy to miss when you're in that operations mode and you talk about being really focused on the mission and not being emotional. There are a lot of other people out there that are being very emotional, mostly from not having knowledge about where the loved ones are.
Oh, exactly. And see, I mean, Tim Odd was killed, the senior ranking guy. Well, everybody knew who he was. We all knew him. And so you can imagine the relationships of the families and everybody starting to deal with this. So, and I'm sure there were more of that. But so it became a very personal event to those people, and they were, one, very willing to do it, but again, it isn't a very pleasurable kind of thing to do.
Oh, that's tough. What about agencies that FBI worked with that were really important to you?
Well, I think the biggest help to us as the FBI was FEMA. A lot of people think of FEMA purely as the post-hurricane or natural disaster. But FEMA brought in their urban search and rescue teams that obviously assisted the fire department. They did a lot of work with our evidence teams as well. And FEMA really helped the Bureau with the logistics, the size of the logistics package. One of the issues that FBI had at the Pentagon was so much of the FBI logistical package was going to New York that we needed some assistance at our scene, and we turned to FEMA. And they really provided expertise that we don't have, to be quite honest with you, and resources to help us do our job at the Pentagon and supporting our efforts. So I don't think FEMA gets enough positive praise, and they were indispensable.
You know, Ron, Jim might be able to answer this a whole lot better than I can, but there were search and rescue elements from around the country that came in. There was a civilian response that came in and overtook the south parking and set up food and other facilities there that I didn't find out till about day 4 they were there, but someone else did. I mean, they were getting fed, and they were providing all this stuff free gratis to everybody on the site. So the response.
And the food stations were being inspected by Arlington health inspectors.
Yeah, probably.
To make sure that the food was actually safe. I mean, you know, you can injure people in a lot of different ways.
But you had people like, you had the Salvation Army down there, the Red Cross down there. They were giving out, it was a very warm day, and you know, none of us showed up with gallons of water, and they were providing water, Gatorade, and things like that to keep the young soldiers who were out there working out in the sun all day long, keep them hydrated so they didn't go down. So this goes on, and I don't know, I can't cover everybody, and I apologize if I've left anyone out.
I don't think any one person knows everyone else.
It was
how
a tremendous
how about
response.
Local law enforcement?
Well,
how's that interface for you?
It was great. The Arlington County Police Department, who had a rep to Unified Command the whole time, did a phenomenal job. You know, one with their evidence teams that we integrated into the FBI evidence teams, and then setting up that security umbrella around the incident site. Arlington Police and the Virginia State Police did a fantastic job in limiting that access, because as Jim said, it's a crime scene, it has to be limited, but also from the safety perspective of secondary attacks. I think we've all trained now to the point you have to be aware of secondary attacks, and you need a good security posture to do that. And the local police, again, Arlington County and the Virginia State Police did a fantastic job on that.
You know, Ron, it's probably a good time to talk a little bit at least about the need for building systems that acknowledge regional cooperation, that certainly a community like Arlington for an event like this, but even New York City, one of the most resource-rich jurisdictions, you know, arguably on the planet, was in need of assistance on 9/11. Now, of course, their event was much larger than the Pentagon, but I think both incidents speak to the need for developing relationships, you know, across jurisdictional boundaries. As Ed mentioned earlier, you know, this whole notion in Northern Virginia of essentially eliminating the jurisdictional boundaries provides for the most effective response on a daily basis. We get services to those in need faster when we don't worry about, you know, whose insignia is on the side of the fire truck or the ambulance. Well, that system, which was in existence then for, you know, 25 years on 9/11, played enormous dividends because we could call on jurisdictions that were part of our daily operating system who knew exactly how to fall in under our incident management system. They knew our standard operating procedures because they used the same ones. Our communications interoperability, at least out of the Northern Virginia units, was virtually flawless. We had to put some things together for some of the other units coming in from elsewhere in the National Capital Region, but there was an effective way to integrate those resources into this common operating system because we did it on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And the fact is that when you're dealing with a crisis response, a large-scale incident, there isn't a community in this country that can deal with it by themselves. They're going to be looking for help somewhere. And you know, the more they can build those relationships and build those capabilities, build those systems in advance of the incident, the smoother it will go once they're faced with that crisis.
The 9/11 Commission described the response of the Pentagon. Actually, didn't discuss it a whole lot. There's very little text devoted to the Pentagon response, and described it as mainly successful for most of the reasons we've been talking about. But they said that no event is flawless. So, you know, what if anything would you have done differently? Yeah.
Yeah, that's always a very tough question, and I get asked that question a lot. It's a very tough question for me because I think the crews and the individuals and all of the partners that we had there, and they truly were partners, performed extraordinarily. And so anything that would be said would be construed to be somewhat of a criticism. And I don't want anything I say to become a criticism, because there is no criticism from my standpoint for any of those partners. The working out of the ability to communicate across the wide spectrum of an incident like this, I think could have been and should have been, and hopefully today will be improved. It is a very, very difficult and complex array of individuals who have to be there. I mean, just think of the transportation people. Just think of VDOT, who's trying to get traffic to and from up and down 395 and on the interstates through 66, that have to know what's going on because they're part of the process for solutions. And you've got to work that. And the Joint Operations Center, where we had over 60 players there being fed information on a daily basis, that has to be improved and seamless. I think it's a great place for new technologies. I also think it's a great place to affirm the systems that we have and make sure that we don't leave a key player out. I'm thinking back now that one of the key players in this whole process was a medical examiner from Virginia. I mean, she had a role to play in this incident. And how are we going to manage that particular aspect of this incident? And I think that happens in every major incident. You can't ignore the medical examiner, the constitutionally required aspects that have to occur when a death has occurred. And how do you bring those into the process, and how do you make it all work seamlessly? So it's communications. It's continue to hone in on your communications. I think I would focus more on that in the future. I truly would.
If people are doing their plans and doing training and testing, That's one of the key areas you zero in on.
As well as redundancy in communications.
Okay.
And make sure you have multiple ways to get information to people. Multiple, if they get the same message 3 times, that's better than getting it none.
Yeah. What would you have done differently?
Well, I think I'm in an enviable position because I left the Army a couple years later, and in all honesty, since then, since I've been going back and seeing what the guys done, they've implemented many of the things that we wanted to do. Dovetailing on what Ed said, the command went ahead and restructured itself, knowing that we were going to be in the national capital region come, whatever, we're going to be here. We're an asset available. Why not roll us under NORTHCOM, which has the responsibility for the military for the for the continental United States? We went in and presented that as a plan, and that was accepted. And so So
basically what you created somewhat ad hoc on 9/11 has been institutionalized?
Exactly. It's been institutionalized and been helped to fund with some joint money to be able to do some of the work they need to do. We went out and we put money aside to buy new communications capabilities. We now have a van, a big vehicle that will roll in and has all the connectivity to plug into anybody just by sitting there, put up masts and whatever, and can start bringing in comms right to that location.
So a lot of those have been bought around the country. Has that been a worthwhile investment, these communications command vehicles?
If you use it once, it will be.
Yeah, I have to agree that communications is at the heart of this. I mean, you can do all the planning that, the pre-planning and even the exercising and, building these systems that we've been talking about. But if you get on the incident scene and you're incapable of communicating with each other and, again, with people oftentimes outside the incident scene. I mean, there were times on this incident scene where we had to be party to secure communications that, couldn't be shared outside traditional means. So, I think some of these capabilities are absolutely essential, and I would echo that when you need them, there isn't a replacement for them. There isn't an alternative. Now, have we overinvested? Have we missed opportunities to share some of these resources? Perhaps. I mean, certainly on 9/11, our fire department did not have that kind of command pod or command capability. We had to initially use our police departments, and when that was less than adequate, we actually were afforded the opportunity to use that from the Fairfax County Police Department. But harking back to something I said a short time ago, that came as a result of these regional collaborative relationships that had really matured to a state that they weren't questioning why they were giving up a fundamental resource that they had. They simply knew that it was critical to supporting the overall effort.
But if there had been an attack at the CIA or Fort Belvoir?
Well, the regional system would have provided for another command unit that would have taken their place out there. And again, that's one of the beauties of having a system that acknowledges that your capabilities don't stop at a political boundary, at a jurisdictional boundary, that you can move resources up to fill in gaps as they continue to occur.
So I'm hearing that similar theme of the importance of institutionalizing relationships and capability.
Well, and you asked the question about is it a wise investment for those types of units. Remember, it's only an investment, and the investments will not solve the problem. It is cooperation. It is making sure that you've built your proper alliances. It is making sure that you thoroughly understand who needs to be communicated to about what, and make sure that all those processes are in play. Having the physical resources to do that is critical, absolutely critical, but not the absolute essential piece of this whole thing. It's the complete package of communications.
Would you have done anything different?
I don't know if we would change a lot of things. I think post 9/11, the Bureau has made some very substantive changes. The Bureau has always been investigatively focused. We're now, obviously, it's still pre-terrorism investigatively focused, but around the country now, the Bureau has created more response elements that operate with first responders day in and day out. I think that's a very positive development. I think the relationship that the FBI has now developed, not just with law enforcement, but with the fire service, as well as emergency managers, public health, I think that has gone 100 miles down the road than what it was on 9/11, where traditionally the Bureau was very law enforcement focused. And in some of the bigger cities, we had really stretched out to the other members of the response community. Whereas today, through this WMD program that's out there, we're talking to emergency managers, we're talking to fire, police, hospitals, so that we have a real team approach to responding and dealing with terrorist attacks. I think that's probably the best thing we've done.
Yeah, what worries you today?
You know, what worries me, we talk about investments and what's a wise investment and what's not. We've spent an incredible amount of money and training effort on WMD type attacks, chem bio, and what concerns me is we haven't focused on what we're hitting every day, and that's explosive attacks or small scale tactical attacks like you see in a Mumbai type situation. All training is good, working together on any scenario is good, but what worries me is conventional explosives and small scale attacks like you saw in Mumbai, and I wish we could drive more of our training to dealing with those type situations, because I think it's much more practical and we see it every day around the world. Luckily we haven't seen it here, but if you look at the failed terrorist attacks or the ones that the FBI has been fortunate enough to stop in the last 3 years, they are 99% of them an explosive-based attack or a tactical-based assault.
What worries you?
Well, a lot of things you know, can contribute to staying awake at night. To add on to this, I think where I still think we can invest some more, focus some more, is on building resilient communities. I think, you know, one of the topics we haven't talked about here is how the average citizen contributes to all of this. To link it to one of your other questions about what would I have done differently, I probably would, on that day, I probably would have drove a little bit more some decisions around public communication, how we reached out to the Arlington community and in fact the entire region to inform them of what's going on. Now, 9/11 at the Pentagon was, you know, a confined event. It, as you know, we've talked about it. It's a military installation. You know, security was actually fairly easy to gain control of, at least as compared to had the event happened somewhere else in the Arlington community. But I think that where we've really got to continue to focus is building you know, our systems to acknowledge that the true first responders are going to be the average citizen on the street who are going to be the first to arrive at an incident scene. And if it's a really large-scale incident, if it is truly of crisis proportions, then we're going to be depending on a lot of people in our communities to fend for themselves and not become you know, over-demanding of scarce resources that are going to be concentrated at the heart of the crisis scene.
The true first responders at the Pentagon were the co-workers there.
They absolutely were. The real heroes of that day were the people that go to the Pentagon every single day. More lives were saved by the people that go in and out of that building as their daily workplace than by, you know, fire and police that showed up on that morning. So absolutely, and the military obviously is focused on that kind of quick response and reacting to a crisis like that. But we've got to get average citizens to take some responsibility and understand that they have a role in this enterprise also.
So more effort on community preparedness.
More effort on community preparedness, more effort on building strong neighborhoods that can look after each other in the middle of a crisis. You know, and that crisis doesn't have to be of 9/11 proportions. It doesn't have to be of Katrina-like proportions. It can be, you know, 3 feet of snow that falls in a community, and in any particular neighborhood in a place like Arlington, there is somebody that, you know, depends on Meals on Wheels to get their daily sustenance, that depends on their prescriptions to be delivered by the pharmacy. Well, how are those kinds of essential goods going to get through, you know, to the elderly person that lives alone if his or her neighbors are not looking after them, if they're not even aware that she's among them and has special needs during a crisis? So those are examples of, I think, building resilient communities, and the more we can get our average citizens to acknowledge that they have a role, and for that matter, government leaders to also acknowledge that they need to engage with people at a community level, you know, that's how we'll build strong communities and better responses for the future.
Thank you. You're retired from the U.S. Army. What are you doing now, and did your experiences on 9/11 change you in any way?
Well, I work for a contracting company downtown and have people around the world working for me. In short, I'm not sure that there was any single thing on 9/11 that caused me to change. Obviously, for many of us, it was our first physical contact with terrorism on a personal level. So I'm sure that had some impact. But I don't think, I think the military experience kind of prepares you for this kind of deal, and we've been through similar events and deployments, unknown, no notice kinds of things, deaths and so forth, and so we have some kind of capability to deal with that internal, connection to this and to be able to make it work. But to spin off on your earlier question, what worries me the most, much of what was already said, I ditto that big time. But the one thing I would offer up would be complacency bothers me. As we get further away, as things change, as lives go on, as we do things and we lose track, we forget. The bad guys only got to get right once. We've got to be right all the time. Otherwise, we're into reacting and we're doing consequence management, which we'd rather not do. We'd rather be in the preventive mode. That becomes very difficult. So all the way from senior government officials all the way down into the communities, complacency is gonna hurt us. How we fix that takes strong leadership, people who are willing to go out and basically make the case and spend the money at the right time for this stuff. Do the training and participate. And that's going to take leadership. It's the only way it's going to get solved.
Ed, you're retired from fire chief. What are you doing now? And did 9/11 affect you in any way personally?
I'm the Assistant Executive Director with the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and daily work in a preparedness role for our nation with fire service assets, fire and EMS assets throughout the United States, but also around the world, and what I get a chance to do. It's impossible to say that you could have gone through 9/11, particularly performing the role that I performed, without being affected by it. I mean, it's a life-altering, community-altering, life-altering, nation-altering series of events that occurred. So we all were affected by it, and we can't paint it any other way. Personally, I was affected. I was a firm believer that you have to rely upon good people to do the right things at the right time, and I think that was affirmed that day. So a lot of my beliefs were affirmed. Build the right infrastructure, have faith and confidence in the people, give them their lead and let them perform, and they will amaze you. They will amaze you continuously with the level of performance. I think it was also an extraordinarily valuable lesson about cooperation and making sure that you always affirm those partners that you've built over the years, and make sure that the systems are there to affirm those collaborations and those partnerships. We live as regions. We live in regions. We're regional entities today. We might have lived based upon a river bank years ago, but we don't anymore. We now live in the United States based upon a region. Let's make sure that we affirm our preparedness on a regional level as well. If we do that, we will not only be better prepared, but we will be smarter prepared. So
you've gotten a promotion since 9/11. You've gone from weapons of mass destruction to anti-terrorism. I don't know if that's moving up or not. So what are you doing today, and did 9/11 affect you in any way personally?
Today I'm the Assistant Special Agent in charge for counterterrorism and special operations at the Washington Field Office. I think, as the Chief said, 9/11 has to affect you. I think it's affected me personally in a redoubling of my effort for counterterrorism. Especially on the FBI side, where we see all the secret cables and all the intelligence that's out there that I think thankfully the American public doesn't see every day. It really drives it home as to what we're doing and why we have to work so hard. And we do work hard. It's an incredible cost that I think the members of the FBI pay on their family by the amount of time that they work to find these plots before they occur and to disrupt them. And then in the response, we're going 24 hours a day to all of the communities to make sure that events that happen are not terrorist related. So I think I've redoubled my effort, as I think everybody on my teams has done, and it showed us what is the cost of not being vigilant. You know, what's the cost of not working as hard as you can every possible day? Because all it takes is that one goal, and then hundreds of people can be killed.
You've gone from assistant chief to chief. 9/11 changed you any?
Well, I think it's brought a lot of the things that, you know, that we prepared for in advance of 9/11. You know, it made them real. So there's a certain satisfaction that we were on the right track and that we built some effective systems and capabilities that could react effectively to an event like that. I guess it also taught me that as I assumed the position of chief, that I don't have the real luxury of trying to run the fire department. You know, I have to lead an organization where I've got good leaders beneath me who can do the daily work of running the organization, so that I can work at this institutionalization process, so that I can work across these boundaries, not just regional boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries, but also work with our partners in law enforcement, our partners in public health, our partners in emergency management, our partners in the nonprofit world, who all contribute to this enterprise. So, you know, beyond going through the experience, you know, the shared experience that others here went through, it's more about, you know, how do I focus on the right things, and how do I build an organization that will sustain these efforts after I leave, you know, whenever that is. So I guess it's made, you know, the ideas that we were contemplating before 9/11 more real in a way that I don't think any of us could have predicted or invited, certainly, you know, but I'm glad we did that work, and now that work continues. It just continues on a new level, because I think that the threat is, you know, ever more realistic than perhaps it was when we were doing that planning before 9/11. I think, you know, if anything else, it is about understanding that my role is to serve a community, and that community has something to offer, you know, in this enterprise also. And we ignore that, you know, really at our own peril, because sooner or later we are going to face another incident. You know, whether it's as large scale as 9/11 or smaller, we're going to be depending on those people. And you know, part of my role is to engage with them, to find out what their needs are, and also sort of in the leadership role, prompt them to engage with each other.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming together. Jim Jackson, the U.S. Army, representing Department of Defense, Command, the Pentagon. Chris Combs, representing the FBI. Ed Plaugher and Jim Schwartz, Arlington County Fire and Rescue Department. Thank you for your outstanding response on 9/11. Thank you for what you've done every day, and for your careers in public service.